Hi, um, my name's Terry Lay, and the series is called What's Wrong with the World and How to Fix It. And I'm going to do 3 YouTubes on this topic. So this is about culture war, what's being called culture wars, and it's like not directly about that, but it's about the class conflicts which affect the environmental politics. And I'm going to concentrate on the rich countries, but some of these ideas are also relevant to the developing world. And so in a way, the class politics of the environmental crisis are really obvious, and I've talked about this in previous YouTube talks. So, for example, capitalism is an economic structure which creates competition between firms, and there's a necessity for managers or owners of firms to expand and to increase their profits. And doing that, they do 2 things. One is they cut corners where environmental risks are concerned, and the other thing is that they resist any regulations by government which might have an effect on their profits, any regulations intended to look after the environment. And when we're looking at employees or the proletariat, as Marx would call it, then they have various reasons for resisting environmental regulation and serious environmental restructuring as well within the context of a capitalist economy. They've got the necessity to have a paid job, and so they're scared of an economic downturn, and if they can be persuaded that any particular environmental regulation might lead to an economic downturn or to a loss of jobs in any particular sector, then they're likely to resist that. In terms of purchasing consumer goods, they want to purchase the cheapest things because they experience their work situation as alienating, and they look for compensation in the consumer goods that they buy. So again, they're not going to necessarily take account of environmental downsides to what they're purchasing, and they purchase things for a whole lot of reasons to do with compensating them for a life of alienated labor, like so they get huge sense of power and control by owning a vast 4-wheel drive and so on, which they don't get in their work. Also, when we're looking at the working class in particular, measures which are environmental measures which may only affect a small number of workers, it doesn't mean that only that small number of workers are going to resist these measures. The working class identifies as the working class, and they're likely to vote against measures which are going to affect, even if it's going to affect only a small section of the working class. They vote in solidarity, and this is really obvious from the sort of interviews that I've been doing, and explains things like the fact of the Adani mines that probably partly cost the Labor Party the government in the previous election in Australia. There was only like a small number of jobs actually in it, but the vast numbers of working class people in Queensland voted against the Labor Party because they thought that the Labor Party was ambivalent on the topic of whether the coal mines, the Adani coal mines, should go ahead. Okay, so these aspects of the class politics of environmentalism are really obvious, and I have talked about these before and probably may again, but this series of 3 talks is designed to dig deeper and look at how environmental messages and environmental politics are read by different sections of the population looked at in class terms, and how the kind of pre-existing class conflicts which animate current capitalism affect environmental political processes. And the reason why I'm doing this is that I think it's absolutely essential that people who want to move forward on environmental political reform could understand what these class politics are, because otherwise you're kind of going blind, basically. And you will not get very far, and we haven't got very far. Since the mid-90s, only like 10% of the Australian population have been voting for the Green parties, and the situation's not much better in other parts of the world. And you'd have to say like that represents a failure. And I mean, and it's really obvious if you look into it that you know, like the ALP is still planning to export vast amounts of coal, and certainly they have a much better policy than the Liberal Party. But the Liberal Party doesn't even want to put a date on when we get to zero emissions. So, you know, like the response in the rich world to the crisis of the environment is inadequate. All right, so leaving all that aside for the moment, let's move on. So this first talk is on the sociological theories of class in post-war, post-Second World War capitalism. And I'm, you know, like if you find all of this a bit abstract and so on, please go on to the next talk, which will detail in more, you know, the responses of the ordinary members of the community to environmental politics. But you know, like for those who are interested, this is the basic sort of structural analysis which informs that analysis of people's attitudes that I'm going to do in the next two talks. So there are various sociological theories about social class, occupational groupings, economic groupings, and cultural differences, if you like, within modern society. Marx's famous prediction in the Communist Manifesto, written in the 1840s, was what's sometimes been called immiseration. In other words, that the working class would get poorer and poorer, and certainly poorer relative to the profits of the capitalist class, and that the middle class, which, you know, in his day was identified with small petty owners of shops and small commercial outfits and so on, would get progressively smaller as larger and larger companies came to dominate the social space. And like that prediction has basically come, you know, it obviously hasn't worked out quite like that in the rich countries. Instead, what's happened is that it's certainly in absolute terms, the income and purchasing power of ordinary people increased, right? It's at least up to 1975, and after that it's sort of stagnated. And the middle class, far from going away, had a revival, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But, you know, like it's actually expanded into sort of all sorts of middle class jobs like teaching and nursing and whatever. And so there's been growing affluence in real terms and the post-war growth of a professional middle class. And these events are the effect of various kinds of class struggle and compromise. You know, in other words, the working class pushed the capitalist class to increase incomes and so on. All right, so the first, I'm going to basically use two theoretical frames of reference, which are not easily mapped onto each other. They're kind of different in various ways that are hard to reconcile. But I find both of them very helpful in understanding what's going on the ground, as it were. So Barbara and John Ehrenreich in the 70s, the time of the huge Vietnam War mobilizations, wrote a famous paper called The Professional Managerial Class, which has had a huge influence in sociology. And what they say is that between the 1850s and the 1970s, when they're writing, a new type of middle class has developed in capitalist society, you know, different from the ones that Marx was writing about. And so who is this middle class? It consists of technical workers who are trained in technology, managerial workers, you know, like executives that manage, you know, places and so on, and like accountants and all of these people, lawyers, whatever. And cultural workers, you know, like entertainers or teachers even, you know, like depending on how you define cultural workers. And the Ehrenreichs say that the role of the professional managerial class is to reproduce capitalist culture and class relations. So they stand between the working class, like, which is being basically deprived of all skills and management and control of their working lives, and the capitalist class, which are the people who invest and have lots of money and so on, and that ruling class. And between them, there's this intermediate strata, the professional managerial class, which kind of mediate this relationship and control the working class for the benefit of capitalism as a total economic system. So what could you say about them? They're salaried, you know, like, and they're not paid by the hour. In other words, they get a certain regular income. and they earn more than the working class. Well, you know, nowadays that might be a bit debatable, but it's like usually they have sort of perks and conditions and better conditions instead of tenure and permanency and superannuation and so on than working class tradies who might be earning more per hour. And most of the working class is earning less than this professional managerial class. There's no two ways about it. They're mental workers, you know, like they're called mental workers in the sense that they have university degrees, and their role is not to dirty their hands in actual production and, or, you know, serving cups of tea or whatever, but actually to sort of, to organize things in some way or another. But there's very similar to the rest of to the working class, let's say, to the unskilled labor or, you know, other employees, a vast bulk, like the 70% of the population who you could define as working class. They're very similar to those people in the sense that, like them, they don't own the means of production. They're not big, you know, they're not people who own companies and own firms and own vast amounts of, you know, shares well and truly beyond their daily needs and so on. That's not who they are. They're not part of the 1% in that phrase. They're more like the next 5 to 20%. So why are these people necessary to the functioning of capitalism? You know, the Ehrenreichs believe that the rise of this class has come about because of certain requirements of modern capitalism. So they're there because the bargain between employees and the capitalist class has been that as technology improves through, you know, competitive struggle and so on, that more affluence is possible, and the working class pushes to get higher wages and so on. And this leads to an affluent working class, which means two things. One is that there's a surplus of consumer goods which can be directed towards this new middle class without them actually dirtying their hands in production. One, and two, that the working class itself, this extra consumption needs to be managed. You need people to advertise and show people how this is used and talk to them about, you know, looking after their health and all of this stuff. So that whereas in like prior to the 1850s, the capitalist class, you would control the working class with force, you know, like unemployment, you know, like if you get into criminal activity, you'll be hanged and sent to Australia and all these sort of things. That now it's the carrot of consumption, so that people are drawn in to participate and be loyal citizens by the promises of working hard and getting consumer goods. The professional managerial class, which they always shorten to the PMC, and I'll start doing that in a minute, they manage this arrangement. They encourage the compliance of ordinary people, you know, like, you know, how not to get angry with your boss, how to improve your chances of getting a better job, how to play better tennis. I mean, you name it, right? And they make sure control is still maintained, so that these various kinds of forms of advice and talking to people and telling them how to behave and what's the morally correct way to do things, or the most advantageous way to do things, this sort of self-help advice and so on, is maintaining compliance. And you can, and also even entertainment, you know, like come home from a hard day at the office and veg out in front of the television. Well, you're not doing anything more dangerous and radical, like gathering together with your friends to throw Molotov cocktails through the windows of the rich or anything like that. So the Ehrenreichs say that because of their role in society, and this is really important for my later analysis of environmental politics, there's a dislike, a contradiction, a standoff, a sort of conflict, implicit or whatever, between the professional managerial class and the working class. And like on the one hand, both of these groups sell their labor power, like they, you know, have to earn a living to etc. But the professional managerial class is only there because of exercise of control and cultural management of their lives has been taken away from the working class. I mean, the classic study which backs this up is Braverman's study of manufacturing, and what Braverman shows is that, you know, whereas in previous periods of history, skilled trade workers would would train up apprentices, and they would work out how to make something, you know, like a machine part or something with a lathe, metal lathe or whatever. Now what happens is that that's all kind of automated, if you like, and managed by another class, you know, a paper replica of the factory, which is being worked out by engineers and sort of put onto diagrams and nowadays coded into computer programming and so on. So that that the skills of ordinary people that they used to use to manage their work have been taken away from them. And the Ehrenreichs would say this applies to culture, you know, like people used to make their own music in pubs, like what we now call folk music, and it's like, and now they sit down in front of TV to watch The Voice while some professional gets up and produces stuff and so on. And so in a way, if you had a sort of like a communist dream utopia, that the ordinary people would reclaim this cultural management and this management of their lives and this management of production, and this kind of division into mental and manual would be dissolved. So in a sense, what they're saying is that this division is an artificial division created by capitalism, and no wonder it causes conflict, because the professional managerial class are in control and telling people what to do or encouraging them to do various things, and the other people are sort of the passive recipients of this advice or management, as the case may be. So in daily life, the relationships between the professional managerial class and the working class are often fraught, and you know, like, yeah, and equally between those vested with middle class authority and the public that they serve, which may be other middle class people. Like I'm old enough to remember in universities when the Turnitin system was introduced, by which people would submit their essays online, right? And so it'd come as a file, and then it'd go to Turnitin, which is a huge computer program in the sky, and that would reveal if a student had copied words from another text without citing it properly. You know, like it'd just show up as a copy, and when there was like 60% of copying, you'd have a look at it and say, oh, you've plagiarized, and they'd be in trouble and they might fail the course and so on. So what is this all about? It's about the antagonism, if you like, between students who want to get good marks without doing the least work and then get a degree and get a good job and so on, and staff whose reputations and university and the worth of degrees and so on depends upon them stopping this behaviour. These kind of conflicts are endemic in every part of society, and they represent the conflict between the professional managerial class and those whom they're controlling. And in the factory situation, for example, I was supervising a student who was doing a PhD on workers in Cessnock, and it's like they talked about the aluminium factory there, the Alcan factory, and the people who came round to give time and motion studies and tell them how to run what was called the pot line were referred to as theory wankers, and the guys at the plant would when they came to the cafeteria to sit down, they'd, you know, do terrible things to them, fart in front of them and so on, all, you know, like give them a very hard time. So these kind of situations are everywhere within modern society, these kind of minor conflicts. And the Ehrenreichs say the subjective dimension of these contacts is a complex mixture of hostility and deference on the part of working class people, and contempt and paternalism on the part of the professional managerial class who regard these people as idiots, or I mean that they're tempted to think that. And like clearly, you know, like one of the great sociological studies ever done is Paul Willis's study of working class kids in a high school in England. And it's like, what that talks about is school resistance. So the whole schooling situation is one in which the professional managerial class of teachers are responsible for educating the working class kids, and of course the middle class kids, but the working class kids are immoral to do much worse at school than the middle class kids, and they are very unlikely to get into the middle class jobs and so on. This is the Paul Willis's idea, and one of the ways in which the control of the professional managerial class of teachers is exercised, and he shows this in the book is by contemptuous sarcasm, in which they put down these guys. I mean, the whole idea of doing well at school is that you do well at school if you work hard and if you're intelligent, right? That's the myth of meritocracy. So consequently, if you're doing badly in school, you know, you're going to be annoyed, one, and two, but you're being told, you know, that you're not then you're not bright, that you're not working hard. Now, the reality, as sociologists of education have shown, is that there's a whole lot of middle-class skills which middle-class parents pass on to their children, which enables them to do well in the school situation, which working-class parents don't have that cultural background and are not doing that, you know, anyway. So it's, you know, a really unfair system, and Willis talks it's about what he calls a penetration, meaning an insight of working-class kids into how unfair this situation is. All right, now I'm going to talk about Bourdieu. Pierre Bourdieu is a French sociologist who's died recently, and well, not that recently, but anyway. And he also gives an account of how classes work in modern capitalism, which is quite different to the Ehrenreichs. Although, you know, as you'll see, there are some points of overlap that are really important. And the book that he wrote that's most germane to this topic is called Distinction. It's a huge blockbuster of a book. It's bloody amazing. But anyway, it was based on research in France in the late 60s. And these are partly based on interviews, partly based on media analysis, things like theatre reviews and a whole lot of different kinds of media analysis, but also based on surveys, you know, like what kind of music do you like? Pick from the following list of, you know, popular music or classical music items that you like and so on. And what he does from this is create a map of social class positions in terms of cultural taste related to occupational groupings, right? So there's a correlation between what occupational grouping you're in within capitalism and what kind of cultural taste you have in food, you know, in furnishings, in music, you know, in artwork and so on. Now, the details of Bourdieu's analysis may not apply in other first world countries. I mean, this is very variable, and Bourdieu himself is massively aware of how it varies year to year and so on. You know, like the Blue Danube's in 1 year and then 10 years later, the same occupational group hates it. You know, like this goes on all the time, but it's like, nevertheless, the general picture of the sort of structure of this and the ideas that lie behind these structures of taste, I mean, I totally believe that Bourdieu's analysis still applies in modern capitalist societies in the rich countries, like Australia, America, UK, Europe, and so on. Okay, so now I'm going to explain his map. Okay, so he looks at what he calls the social space of social class, and he talks about class fractions, you know, like little bits of a class, you know, a fraction of a class. And these class fractions can be identified in social space in terms of the volume of capital that they have, you know, how much capital they have, and the kind of capital. So he extends Marx's idea of economic capital and develops some ideas of other types of capital. And the most important other one that I'm going to be talking about is cultural capital. So cultural capital is things like, it's a possession of a formal educational qualification recognized by the state. All right, so, you know, like technical, you know, primary school certificate, whatever, high school leaving certificate, baccalaureate, whatever it might be, you know, like engineering degree, degree from the Big Eight, degree from a lesser university, etc. Right? So that's part of what cultural capital is, but it's also the other cultural understandings and knowledge which is associated with those educational qualifications. So, you know, like a knowledge of classical music, a knowledge of how to speak grammatically and write grammatically. These kind of less formal qualifications or skills, if you like, are associated very closely with cultural capital as education, formal educational qualifications. Obviously not exactly, but pretty close. And then, okay, so I've said, first of all, it's the volume of capital that you've got that gives you social space. And the second is whether it's economic capital or cultural capital. And the economic capital is obviously your income for a start, but also wealth, you know, like do you own houses or land or you know, or a factory or shares or whatever. And then he has a diagram of social space. So what I'm going to do now is share screen and show you my version of this diagram. Because share the screen. Okay, here we go. Bourdieu's map of social space. I hope you can see that. So you see, it's hard. It's not like a normal graph, but anyway, up here is economic capital plus and cultural capital plus. So this is the cluster, if you like, at this point of the diagram, which includes people like business leaders who are generally fairly well educated and they have a lot of economic capital, you know, like the capitalist class in Marx's terms is right there. And then engineers and doctors, sort of more on the side of cultural capital, less economic capital. And then higher ed, you know, like the actual staff of universities, even less economic capital, but more cultural capital. So now here you've got cultural capital plus an economic capital minus. So if we look down here, what we see is higher ed at this point, high school teachers and primary teachers. So these people, so higher ed have got lots of cultural capital. High school and primary teachers, they've all have got slightly less. They've got slightly less economic capital as well. Over on this side here, under business leaders, right? So people with the same kind of cultural capital situation, or slightly less actually, and they've got less economic capital, small business, and probably over here, economic capital plus cultural capital minus, you'd put tradies. They've still got, you know, if this is the whole arrow here, they've still got quite a lot of cultural capital, but not as much. So they've got more here, and this is the traditional working class, unskilled workers and so on. Okay. So I'll stop screen sharing there. So as I've said, the kinds of particular items of taste and style and so on, which are associated with these social positions in social space, change over time, but the structure of positions stays the same. And then Bourdieu says that there's an antagonistic relationship between those whose power in society rests on their economic capital and those whose power in society rests on their cultural capital, right? So I'll read it out. The fractions whose reproduction depends on economic capital, usually inherited, right? Industrial and commercial employers at the higher level, craftsmen and shopkeepers, we could put tradies there, and shopkeepers at the intermediate level, are opposed to the fractions which are least endowed, relatively of course, with economic capital and whose reproduction, meaning how do they pass on their power to their children, mainly depends upon cultural capital. Higher education and secondary teachers, the higher level, primary teachers at the intermediate level. In other words, these two class fractions, if you like, are opposed to each other. One class fraction is more depending on economic capital for passing on their power to their children, and the other group is more depending upon their cultural capital, their skills, their educational skills and so on, to pass on their power to their children. So more of any particular kind of capital can change what you call what class fraction you're in. So primary teachers are like higher ed and secondary teachers in having more cultural capital than the rest of society, but have different amounts of it. Like primary teachers have less cultural capital than secondary teachers, and higher ed university teachers have even more cultural capital, right? Office workers are like professionals in having a mix of economic and cultural capital, but have different amounts. So professionals, he means like a lawyer or architect or whatever. So the office worker has a mixture of economic and cultural capital. You know, they have a good, well-paid job. They have security of tenure. They have, you know, superannuation and so on, That's economic capital. and they have cultural capital. You know, they're trained at least to university level at the present time. But the professional, you know, like they might have done a 7-year med degree or something like that, and they're getting even more income and so on. So they're in the same kind of channel, if you like, within the social space diagram, but one group are higher than the other group. Skilled manual workers and shopkeepers are like employers and industrialists in having mostly economic capital, but have different amounts. So, you know, employers and industrialists don't have a lot of cultural capital. Perhaps maybe they haven't even been to uni, or they've just got an undergraduate degree, but they've had huge amounts of economic capital. They own vast amounts of shares or a company or whatever, and then tradies, you know, like, or shopkeepers are in a similar position in having not a huge amount of cultural capital, but they have lots of economic capital compared to the working class, right? He regards economic capital as dominant. You know, he's enough of a Marxist to think that at the end of the day, the material power of those with economic power is more dominant in society at the present time than cultural capital. Yeah, and this is really important for his analysis. In other words, the people with high cultural capital are grumpy in a way. You know, like these uninformed dickheads are taking controlling society and so on. We're the ones who really know the science, or know what's, you know how to live, you know, like or whatever it may be, and they're not happy about that. And then from the other side, those with lots of economic capital, like industrialists and employers, are going, those people are impractical dreamers. You know, what would they know about how to run an economy? You know, we're in control and we should be. And he says the 3 higher ranking fractions of the dominant class are industrial and commercial employers and professionals like doctors and lawyers. So industrial and commercial employers are the ones with more economic capital, and professionals are the ones with more cultural capital. And then the 3 lower ranking fractions are engineers, public service executives, and teachers. So the teachers are the ones with more cultural capital, the public servants, executives and engineers and so on have got more economic capital. So this model differs from the kind of layer cake model vision of a social class. You know, like, you know, as you saw from the diagram, it's like, you know, the 2-dimensional map. You know, it's not like a layer like the rich, the not so rich, the less rich, and so on. That's a layer cake. You know, like just goes in strata. So Bourdieu's vision is like, it has to be expressed in these 2 different arrow, you know, like, what are they called? I don't know. But lines, there's one going that way and a horizontal one, you know, axes, yeah. There's not low, middle and upper class, but a complex field of class positions. And what Bourdieu's done is he's divided the dominant class into 2 halves. There's the class with the part of the dominant class, meaning, you know, like those with more cultural capital and less economic capital, you know, like higher ed would be the classic, you know, like university professors or something. And the other half of the dominant class is people like with less cultural capital and more economic capital, like the owner of, you know, BHP or something like that, obviously. Artistic fractions of the dominant class. Yeah. Before I go on though, let's just look at this as a sort of interesting sideline there. You know how what I've been talking about is Bourdieu's analysis of fractions of the dominant class. Well, now I just have to say within the terms of the Ehrenreichs, it's not so clear what would you say about that. In a sense, those with higher cultural capital and less economic capital, in terms of the Ehrenreichs analysis, would be part of the professional managerial class. But see, they'd use that, so like university professors, right? So but they also would use the professional managerial class to apply to engineers, but also to primary school teachers, or also to entertainers, you know, hosts of TV shows, or, you know, actors, whatever. So Bourdieu and Ehrenreich's kind of pictures of class don't totally map onto each other. But when we get into the practical stuff, which I'll do in the next YouTube talk, you'll see that in a way that doesn't matter. And like, it's fine if you just think of it as the educated middle class, the less educated rich, and the working class. You know, if you just keep those three positions in mind, to my mind, that's fine. That's totally adequate to understand what the data, as it were. Anyway, getting back to Bourdieu, he says that, and this is important too, and you'll see this is absolutely crucial in terms of environmental politics, the artistic tastes of fractions of the dominant class. Both fractions ostentatiously affirm the fact that they do not have to worry about material consumption. Right? So the rich, what do the rich do? Less in cultural capital, more in economic capital. How do they affirm that they don't have to worry? By buying lavishly, by spending on huge boats, by going, oh yeah, you know, like, oh, I'll have caviar tonight, no problem, you know, like, that's how they, or even sometimes the opposite thing. You know, I'm just wearing an old coat because, you know, I can't be bothered with this, you know, designer coat. No, this is all I need. You know, like that's how they express their fact that they don't have to worry about material consumption, right? How does the what he calls the less dominant fraction, you know, like the higher ed people and the artists and intellectuals, how do they do it? They do it, that material display is really vulgar. No, I have moral reasons why I don't want to live like that. No, I'm not getting a guzzling gas tank and, you know, polluting the planet. I'm getting a bicycle and riding around with my kids in a little trailer on the back. You know, it's like, I don't need to worry about material consumption because I think all that material consumption is really vulgar and not to mention damaging, you know, what. Okay. The dominant bourgeois fraction, they like, this is Bourdieu again, they like art that makes you forget social reality. They like art that creates a hedonistic aesthetic of ease and facility. For example, and these are Bourdieu's examples, Boulevard theatre and impressionist painters. Oh, I'm sorry, from an Australian point of view today, Boulevard theatre doesn't mean that much in impressionist painters. But I think if you think of things like The Lion King or, you know, a lavish theatrical production of that kind, which costs, you know, squillions to get into, or going to an exhibition of the French Impressionists or something like that, which is a really obvious thing, artwork to be interested in, you know, like that's more like what the rich. So what would those with higher you know, higher cultural capital be going to? A spiky, difficult work that you can't understand on the theatre side, with everyone dressed in black and grey. Look, or for in terms of artwork, they'd be going to a difficult and strange exhibition, you know, of art, of modernist artwork, recent art. So yeah, I'll come back to some of this stuff later. But anyway, this is Bourdieu on this topic. Whereas the dominant fractions of the dominant class, you know, that's the high economic, whatever, incline towards a hedonistic, you know, meaning pleasure-seeking aesthetic, you know, like the way it's ease and facility, meaning like, you know, yeah, let's do this, let's do that. The dominated fractions, the intellectuals and artists, have affinities with the aesthetic aspect of aesthetics, right? Functionalist design, minimalism, and inclined to support all artistic revolutions conducted in the name of purity and purification, refusal of ostentation, you know, like no showing off, yeah, and the bourgeois taste for ornament. And the dispositions towards the social world, which they owe to their status as poor relations, incline them to welcome a pessimistic representation of the social world. So, you know, like, what Bourdieu is very nasty about these people, but it basically is saying these people with high cultural consumption and less economic power and less power in society, because they find themselves in position, they're more likely to regard the social world taken as a whole as unfair. In other words, they're going to be attracted to a leftist kind of politics to some degree. And like in terms of aesthetics, I'll get back to, you know, like they're likely to eat, you know, yogurt and muesli and brown wholemeal bread rather than white bread. These are aesthetic choices in the sense of eating things that are good for you, that are not lavish sort of things, you know. Yeah. Anyway, and like in the obvious case, of course, there are environmentalists who dress in op shop clothes and ride bicycles and especially when it's a matter of choice, when you know, they could make a different career choice and move into a job with more income and spend more lavishly, but instead they make a choice to live a more environmentalist, aesthetic lifestyle. And from Bourdieu's point of view, that's classic behavior of the high cultural capital, middle class, and upper class. The dominated fraction of intellectuals and artists like art that is socially relevant. Yep. Yeah. Hands up to that one. And presents a critical picture of the social world. So they'll watch Q&A on ABC rather than watching The Voice on a commercial channel, you know, like whatever. They like aesthetics, purity, and the avant-garde. They refuse ostentation and ornament, you know. For example, they like documentaries, difficult artistic films, modernist house interiors. So he said, and all right, so teachers, you know, like who are classic of the high cultural capital and not so much economic capital part of the middle class, teachers richer in cultural capital than in economic capital, and therefore inclined to ascetic, A-S-C-E-T-I-C, that is consumption, in all areas, are most consciously opposed to the fat cats, gross in body and mind, like Gina Reinhardt, for example, Rose Hancock, who have the economic means to flaunt with an arrogance perceived as vulgar, a lifestyle which remains very close to that of the working classes as regards economic and cultural consumption. That's really interesting. So what he's saying is that the rich, you know, with lower cultural capital, emphasize, you know, material, while on the one hand they're saying I don't have to worry about material consumption, and they flaunt their wealth by buying lavish and vulgar economic flaunting and so on. Nevertheless, in terms of choices, cultural choices, they make cultural choices that are in the same cultural sort of field, if you like, as the working class do. So, you know, like I'm trying to think, chops and tomato sauce or something like that. I mean, I don't know, in the Australian context, that's probably what I'm thinking, like a barbecue or something like that, rather than going out to a unique, austere Japanese restaurant. Yeah, maybe, I don't know. And like, okay, so emphasizing this point again, you know, like, and this is why, you know, in that diagram with the arrow, there's the vertical arrow. And so what you've got at the top of that arrow is the rich with slightly less cultural capital. And down the bottom of that arrow, you've got the working class. And both along the arrow, what joins these two groups is that they're culturally, is that they prize, they see the importance of material needs, and they emphasize that in their cultural choices. Whereas this group over here, you know, like, probably looks like over there to you, I'm not sure. But anyway, the group on the left-hand side of the diagram with high cultural capital, the teachers, primary ed, you know, secondary, higher ed, and so on, they downplay the importance of, according to Bourdieu anyway, they downplay the importance of material needs, and they emphasize higher spiritual needs and you know, etc. And okay, and so now link, but then what does he think is the difference between the meals of workers and the meals of the upper classes? The meals of the upper classes are into delicate, healthy, fresh, rare, and elaborate cooking. And the workers are more into large servings, filling, fats, salts, and sugars, and simple cooking and roasts and grills. So he applies this kind of logic to these food tastes as well. And certainly, yeah, like one of the most best studies, you know, like I think I talked about it once earlier in this talk. It's like Jennifer Pont's study of Cessnock working class, a mining town working class people, and an attempt by a university research team and health advocates that was a group of people who had really high rates of heart disease, and the university team was trying to influence them to eat less of those things, you know, fats, salts, sugar, basically. And what Jennifer Pont found was that, like, these people actually live a life of restraint in many ways, but in terms of eating, they believed in eating in terms of these values of indulgence, you know, like, you know, having a large serving, having a roast dinner with lots of fats, animal fats, and then following that up with a dessert with cakes and or custard or whatever. It's like buying soft drinks and drinking them. I mean, alcohol, beer, you know, lots of stuff like that. And so that the heart health people, as Jennifer Pont explains, they had very little impact on these people's cultural choices, because from their point of view, these people were advocating the kind of diet, you know, like what's called rabbit food, you know, like lettuces and so on, that were typical of those with high cultural capital and culturally alien in that sense. And the choices, the food choices, you know, the heart health food choices, if you like, of not eating animal fats, not eating too much sugar, cutting down on salt and so on, were regarded as ascetic, you know, like in the sense like a monk, you know, with a hair shirt or whatever. That's what ascetic means, right? So it's like those choices were regarded as like frugal and kind of wacky in the extreme. And you'll see this when I get to the interviews with people about environmental attitudes, you'll see exactly these kind of issues come up. It's totally fascinating. Okay, so that's the end of this talk. And so in the next talk, I'm going to talk about working class views of environmentalists and how that reflects these kind of class dynamics that I've been talking about today. And then the video after that, I'm going to talk about middle class and business leader, or the rich, you know, the attitudes towards environmentalists and that fraction of the population, the scientists and environmentalists who are pushing environmental issues, how they look at them. And it's really closely related to in all of this, you'll find these analyses of the social class structure extremely relevant to how people look at environmental politics.